This is episode 3 of Democracy After Disaster, a 9-part documentary series that is best listened to in order from episode 1.
In the district round Melbourne and Victoria, a bushfire of terrifying proportions swept the land. Damage valued in terms
On the 13th of January 1939, when the world was on the brink of yet another global war, bushfires raged across Victoria and rocked the foundations of the Australian Settler Society. The day would become known as Black Friday.
Treasured belongings have been dressed in the shabby garments of desolation. Wherever that fiery finger touched.
The drama and poetry of this narration hides a real terror and shock that this could have happened. And this day marks a turning point in the colonists' understanding of the land they were occupying. History shows us patterns and ensures we don't make the folly of thinking how it is today is how it's always been and will always be. Or, that was then, we've moved on now, things are different, better, unrelated. Despite its invisibility, history is carried with us in our bodies and families and institutions, from generation to generation, sometimes consciously, other times not. Australia's First Nations people know this well, where the impacts they experience in a disaster are compounded by the historical impacts of colonisation, which forced them off their land so they were unable to continue to care for country, which in turn increased the conditions for raging infernos of destruction. And according to indigenous scholar from the Australian National University, Byame Williamson,
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, no matter where they're from, no matter when colonisation first hit, no matter how developed their homelands, people have a shared understanding of history, a shared experience of marginalisation, of invasion, of wars and conflicts, and of these disasters as well.
We can also see the enormous benefit of an historical lens when we look at indigenous fire management practices.
Well, the old people always talked about fire and applying fire in a way that is in sync with the seasons and in sync with the breeding times of the animals.
This is Victor Stephenson, an Indigenous author of the book Fire Country and co-founder of the Fire Sticks Alliance, talking on ABC News In Depth.
Most people think that there's no difference in traditional burning and Western burning regimes, but there's a huge difference. When we look at Aboriginal burning, it's a spiritual thing. It's an insult, just to sum it up in 2 words, like cool burning. In the old times, there used to be fire knowledge holders, and those knowledge holders were crucial to be at every burn, and that's where we need to be again.
This history, ignored for the better part of the last 250 years, is proving critical to our future.
When the European came here, they saw a beautiful country, they saw old trees, beautiful landscapes, and the old people maintained that for generations and generations and generations. And so now it's a healing phase for us. It's bringing back that identity, and there's a lot of work to do.
Aboriginal fire was actually making Australia not a natural landscape, but a made landscape. Aborigines made it.
This is Bill Gamage, author of The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia, talking on ABC Landline.
And Europeans, when they came, assumed it was natural, and so they left it alone. And what that meant was that trees and scrub were promoted to the disadvantage of grass. Europeans fear fire, and Aborigines treat it as an ally. It's a totem, a very important totem, but it's also a friend.
There is a growing awareness, interest and support for traditional ways of managing land with fire in Australia, which couldn't happen without a backward lens and deep respect for the value of history. This is Democracy After Disaster, a podcast about power and money and how communities recovering from bushfire or any disaster need to be empowered in their recovery if they're not to be further harmed by the systems meant to help them. My name's Kate Lawrence, and in this 3rd episode of Democracy After Disaster, we're going to look back at the 20th century to 1939 to see what we can glean from the records about Black Friday. We'll then come forward across the post-war era to follow the unfolding changes in community and government relationships. We'll also look at some of the experiences and resistance of indigenous Australians during this period. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this episode contains names and voices of people who have died. If the people we heard about in episode 1, the middle-class, white, educated and community-minded folk of Strathewen, felt they couldn't rely on government, imagine an Aboriginal community in recovery with over 250 years of racist laws and policies, from the theft of land to the forced removal of children to the disempowerment of the Northern Territory intervention. White Australians have been indoctrinated over and over and over to forget the long Indigenous occupation of this country and the ongoing violence and oppression of colonisation. And so we must work to unlearn our forgetting and train ourselves to remember, like Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating would have us do way back in 1992 when he gave a speech in the Sydney suburb of Redfern.
It begins, I think, with an act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine that these things could be done to us.
So in this episode, we'll reweave our memories to remind us of the experiences and perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people during different disasters and more generally in this period of history. One of the towns in the line of fire in 1939 was Newgee, 130 kilometres east of Melbourne. Newgee is in the traditional lands of the Gunai people. It sits at the T-intersection of two valleys, one wide and flat leading to a big town of Warrigal in the south, the other running east-west along the path of the Dirt Yowan, meaning finger, which Europeans call the Latrobe River. To the north, east and west are the southern, heavily treed slopes of the Great Dividing Range. The dispossession of lands and waters from the Gunai people of Gippsland was horrendous. In 1846, Gippsland squatter Henry Mayrick shockingly wrote in a letter home to his relatives in England,
"The blacks are very quiet here now, poor wretches. No wild beast of the forest was ever hunted down with such unsparing perseverance as they are. Men, women and children are shot whenever they can be met with."
The violence and theft of land was total and totally devastating. It began with the gold prospectors.
Newgee is a picturesque town on the banks of the Latrobe River, in the foothills of the Great Dividing Range. Aptly named after the Aboriginal word meaning Valley of Contentment or a place of rest, Newgee was first settled by gold prospectors in the mid-1860s.
After the gold mining, Newgee became a timber town full of lumberjacks cutting the tall trees for commerce.
With the coming of the new year, the harvesting of the timber proceeded as usual. All through the bush, the giant mountain ash was selected for felling and sawn into sections for haulage to the mills.
In 1926, only 13 years before Black Friday, Newgee was again destroyed by fire and 4 people were killed. As 1939 dawned,
Aggravated by prevailing drought conditions, the forest floor, usually damp and moist, became drier and drier. The weather, hotter and hotter. The highest temperatures ever recorded were reached, 114 degrees in the city of Melbourne and 120 degrees and over in the country and in the bush. Little did the bush workers realize that the most disastrous calamity in the history of the state was even then almost upon them.
As the sun rose on Friday the 13th of January, the hot north wind peaked and fires which had been burning for weeks began to fill the sky with towers of burnt orange smoke.
Under a scorching sun and whipped by rising winds, the many small fires which were burning separately seemed to join together in a sudden avalanche of flame.
On that fateful day, the Newgee post office, which was also the telephone exchange, was being run by Gladys Sanderson, daughter of the Newgee postmaster, who was sick that day, so Gladys was in charge. As the fires threatened from the northwest, the train at Newgee station filled with people, making ready to escape to the south. In the hills far and wide outside the town, people waited in their houses, the telephone their only form of communication, and Gladys, the only person in Newgee available to work the switchboard. She knew those people in the hills would die if she couldn't warn them. She watched as the train headed out of town. It made it safely to Warragul, but it was a close call as the timber trestle bridge it crossed was smouldering and later burnt down. Gladys then got her 9-year-old daughter and sick father to the river and went and sat in the post office and made calls.
Hello, Ethel, it's Gladys. The fire's heading in your direction. It'll be up McCarthy Spur within the hour. You'd better get out.
She rang the next one and the next, warning them, telling them what she knew as the fire came screaming over the range. Eventually the fire came to Newgee, the post office began to burn. Gladys kept working until Constable Earnshaw came.
Gladys, come on, let's go! To the river! It's too late for warnings!
And they both bolted for the Latrobe River. Gladys and 70 others sat in the river with wet blankets over their heads for 3 hours. When they came out, all that was left of their town was the pub, the butcher shop and 2 houses. The post office was gone, as was the town's water supply system. In the outlying forests, all was destroyed, including 12 of the 18 sawmills in the Newgee district. And at Saxton's mill, 8 people were dead.
The township of Newgee reduced to heaps of charred ruin for the second time.
These were the traditional lands and waters for tens of thousands of years of the Gunai-Kurnai people. To see this damage to sacred places, to totemic animals and plants and birds, was heartbreak on heartbreak. Gladys went to Warragul, handed in the now useless post office keys, and the next day she was back in Newgee to open the emergency post office. The devastation across the state of Victoria was shocking.
Thousands of square miles of blackened ruin. 71 lives were lost. 69 sawmills destroyed. Travellers on the highway were trapped and perished. Whole townships were obliterated in a few minutes.
In the world of the European colonisers, the reverberations of these fires were enormous.
1939 was undoubtedly a huge turning point in that history of fire in Australia.
This is Tom Griffiths, Professor of History at the Australian National University.
71 people died and untold destruction of communities and industry and, of course, of the forests themselves, although those very same forests need fire to regenerate, of course.
Not only is Professor Griffiths an environmental historian, he's also
resident of Macedon and have been working on fire for some decades as an environmental historian. It was a massive event. It was a huge change in the way in which people saw Australia, saw the bush and saw their relationship to nature in Australia. And it was a very traumatic time, a whole week and more really, when people were in terror of firestorms. There was a Royal Commission that was convened very quickly after the fires and presided over by Judge Leonard Stretton, and that was the major state response to the fires, was to try and answer that question, how could this happen? People were shocked. How could rampant flame just roar out of the bush and kill people like that? Do we know where we live? Do we understand the nature with which we live?
Judge Leonard Stretton took the Royal Commission on a roadshow of the fire-affected areas, hearing evidence from government and forestry workers and residents.
It went into bush communities. It held hearings in local halls under canvas in the bush. Judge Stretton wanted to empower the local storytellers, the local experience. He wanted to hear from bush workers, from sawmillers, from residents, and he did. And there are still in our archives, over 2,000 pages of testimony.
2,000 pages of testimony from over 200 witnesses, all of whom were white men, with the exception of one white woman. So we have a very gendered and colonial view of the circumstances and causes of the fires. Much of the consideration of the Royal Commission and the outrage of the public was directed to the State Forestry Commission and what, if any, responsibility they were to bear for the state of the forests and the lighting and control of the fires.
So after 1939, the Royal Commission, and of course that was a very powerful document that Judge Leonard Stretton produced, not just a powerful legal and government document, but a powerful piece of literature. How many Royal Commissions get prescribed as reading for school English, and how many judges' words echo down the years as his have? These fires were lit by the hand of man. They have not lived long enough. That's what he said of the people living in the bush, of us. We have not lived. Our culture, our European culture, come to the fire continent blind to indigenous experience and wisdom. They have not lived long enough to understand what it means to cope with the fire continent. That's what he was beginning to tell us, and that's a sense in which it was a turning point. And it's notable too that he directed government attention towards the possibility of fighting fire, with intelligent use of fire, that perhaps in the fire continent you shouldn't just be trying to suppress fire, that maybe you had to learn to live with fire. And although there is very little acknowledgement in 1939 of indigenous habitation and of continuing indigenous knowledge, there's the beginning of a movement towards realising that to live here, you have to understand how people have lived here for millennia. And the recommendation to fight fire, with intelligent use of fire, is, of course, what Aboriginal peoples across the continent have done for tens of thousands of years.
The Stretton Royal Commission is entirely focused on the fires themselves, who started them and who should have done what to control them, and what should be done about future fires.
Part of the shock of 1939, Black Friday, was that people were so careless with naked flame in the bush that everyone's boiling billies, they're throwing around matches. It's part of what you do when you're in the bush, It's part of a recreational engagement with the bush. It's how you lived in the bush, was you used flame fairly carelessly. And no one, it seemed, had responsibility for the consequences. Was it the Lands Department? No, not us. Was it the Forest Commission? No. Was it the Water Management bureaucracy? Well, no. They were all blaming one another in the Royal Commission. So part of Judge Leonard Stretton's role was who's responsible and how can we treat fire introduced by people, how can we handle that more responsibly?
Every bushfire inquiry and Royal Commission for the last 80 years has overwhelmingly focused on the fire itself, the cause and conditions and control efforts, and to a certain extent this makes total sense. Other natural disasters, earthquake, cyclone, flood, are phenomenon outside our control. We can prepare for them and react to them, but there's nothing much we can do to stop them happening. Fire is different. Traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways, developed over thousands of years of managing, tending and cultivating the Australian landscape with fire, tells us that we can be, and Indigenous people were and are, active and influential participants in the coming and going of fire in Australia. In more recent times, fire agencies, particularly the volunteer fire brigades, can and do contain, control and extinguish many fires each year. And we now have laws controlling when we can and can't light fires, which have also greatly reduced the risk of human-started fires. And I am eternally grateful for all of this. So it makes some sense that we focus a lot of attention and resources on fire prevention, and when we analyse what happened, we focus on how the fire started and why it wasn't stopped. But this is a blinkered view and also a great trap, both psychologically and physically. It means we've spent decades focusing our time and money almost exclusively on defending against fire and much less on preparing for its inevitability. (1939) was a watershed moment in Victoria for fire prevention and preparedness. It led eventually to the formation of the Country Fire Authority. But I wanted to know about recovery. How did communities manage? What did government do or not do? What was the relationship between them? And how and why has all this changed in the decades since? I began with an assumption that communities in 1939 would have been more connected and self-sufficient, supporting each other in some idealised version of barn raising, and that government would have been a more peripheral, remote, less involved presence. This, it turns out, was a totally romanticised fiction from my imagination. In fact,
there's a really strong tradition in Australia of looking to government for assistance in a crisis.
This is Professor Frank Bongiorno, a history academic and author from the Australian National University.
Probably goes back to the very earliest circumstances of Australia as a settler country. The penal system, the convict system, the responsibility of government going right back to 1788 to ensure that no one starved. I mean, it was the basic responsibility of government, that in those days, the governor, to look after even the humblest settler. And I think that ethic has been incredibly powerful through Australian history.
Professor Bongiorno is clearly talking about white settler society, not Indigenous peoples, who were able to sustain themselves for thousands of years before they were driven off their lands, the injustice of which they have never stopped fighting against. Less than a year before Black Friday saw one of the most important protests in Australia's history. On the 26th of January 1938, over 1,000 Aboriginal people dressed in black marched through the streets of Sydney in silent protest at the reenactment and celebration of the landing of the First Fleet 150 years earlier. It was the first national day of mourning and protest. The march finished at the Australian Hall in Elizabeth Street, Sydney. In 2023, the ABC filmed Annie Druitt reading the demands of the protest. Annie's grandmother, Pearl Gibbs, helped organise the event.
We, representing the Aborigines of Australia, assembled in the conference at the Australian Hall, Sydney, on the 26th day of January 1938. This being the 150th anniversary of the white man's seizure of our country, hereby make protest against the callous treatment of our people by the white men during the past 150 years. And we appeal to the Australian nation of today to make new laws for the education and care of Aborigines. And we ask for a new policy which will raise our people to full citizen status and equality within the community.
A year later, in the west of Victoria, the Aboriginal mission at Lake Condah was devastated by the 1939 fires. And while the newspapers have detailed accounts of colonist losses,
Mr. Bannon lost most of his milling equipment, and Mr. Tonkin's shed was destroyed, and Mr. McKinnon lost 700 fence posts.
There is no reporting of the impact of the fires on the Lake Condah mission. But in the winter after the fires, newspapers report that 2 houses have been built at the Lake Condah Reserve by the Hamilton Aborigines Uplift Society, described as
a Christian organisation working in God's name for the temporal, moral and spiritual uplift and permanent welfare of the Aboriginal community and race.
The 2 houses are to replace 3 that were burnt. Mr. Heine from the organisation addressed the handing over ceremony.
The Aboriginal race had given us a continent.
A self-serving delusion given the active resistance and wars fought by indigenous Australians.
Now by these means, Australia was endeavouring to pay the debt and make amends for the neglect of past years.
There are 60 other people living at the reserve in deplorable conditions, and the government response is to declare that the mission land will be sold. The Portland Guardian reports,
it is pointed out that the Lake Condah Aboriginal Reserve is the property of the Board for the Protection of Aborigines. It is not the property of the Aborigines.
In relation to the white people's recovery process, there's no book or even a thesis to tell us how it unfolded in 1939. But from scouring the newspapers at the time, it seems that there were some things that were very similar in 39 to later fires. In 1939 and all subsequent fires, people outside the area gave both goods and money. The government set up a committee, the State Bushfire Relief Committee. The Lord Mayor's Fund received the financial donations and controlled where they were allocated, and the Red Cross was crucial in providing emergency relief. In Newgee, a community hub organically developed and acted as a grocer, baker and chemist, clothing, hardware and furniture store, and most of all, a place for connection. Getting children back to school was important, and there was talk of abandoning the township altogether after this second destruction in less than 15 years. But the quick re-establishment of the timber mills saw this idea fade away. Like many other fires before and since, after the fires came rain and snow. In Newgee, 6 weeks after Black Friday, torrential rain fell, turning everything to mud. The public reserve near the river was under 4 feet of water and families in tents had to be moved. And later that year recorded the heaviest snowfall on record. Within 3 months, there's frustration with the rate of progress. Winter is coming on, the school's been moved from the hotel to a tent, and with delays in rebuilding, families are also still living in tents. The government timelines see some people miss out on financial support, and the rebuilding of the Newgee Hall is mired in conflict about costs and debt and the Lord Mayor's Fund, etc., etc. As winter deepens, conditions become harsher and progress gets slower. The following is the closest I found to an acknowledgement in the news accounts at the time of the difficulties of recovery, particularly for women raising children.
Only their pillows know what sorrows, what broken hopes for security and comfort for themselves and their families weigh down these women, facing a seemingly barren future so courageously up there when they're alone.
A few things were different in 1939 from later years, though. Firstly, one of the top priorities is getting men back into jobs. The working needs of women, including single women, single mothers and widows, are not on anyone's radar.
The 1930s was about economic recovery, was about rebuilding infrastructure. It was a society, of course, in which the male breadwinner ethic was very dominant, in which the most important basis for society and the economy in the 1930s was a sense that you kept able-bodied men in jobs and the rest would kind of look after itself. That's not how the world it's not how the world worked then. It's certainly not how the world was seen to work.
The Forest Commission and the Country Roads Board became tasked with employing the now out-of-work forest workers in the reconstruction effort, which mostly focused on the salvage of timber and the roads needed to make that possible. For months, the community waits for the government to make clear its forest policy, and when it does, It's good news for Newgee. It will be the centre of the timber salvage scheme, the reforestation and the training of the next generation of foresters. It's not such good news for the Gunai-Kurnai people, who can only watch as the forests and all that live in them are desecrated by logging. Another difference is that there's no mention of trauma, mental health impacts, or any psychosocial support. There's no mention of community input into decision making. In fact, it's very clear from this article in the Herald in July that recovery is seen in quite limited dimensions.
The last tent has gone from Newgee. In place of Tent Town is a brand new settlement. Spick and span little shops, their windows and doors picked out in green or brown against the now prevailing grey of concrete brick or plaster sheeting walls, are doing business as usual in Newgee. Homes, built largely from the bushfire fund, stand fresh and neat beside the ruins of nearly every home. Here and there a breadwinner is out of work through sickness, but there is work now sufficient to absorb every able-bodied man in Newgee.
But trauma is there, in the devastation to country on top of the anguish of colonisation, in the grief of losing loved ones and animals, possessions and homes, community and connection, and in the sheer terror of nearly dying. But in the way of the times, it's all glossed over, not mentioned, or made light of, as if that means it doesn't exist.
In 1939, my feeling is that people weren't encouraged to talk greatly about the trauma that they had experienced. And indeed, I worked with Moira Fay, a historian and filmmaker who interviewed 1939 survivors 60 years afterwards. 60 years afterwards, and for many of them it was the first time they had ever spoken of that event, and they'd carried a sort of silenced trauma with them throughout those 6 decades. They broke down, burst into tears, were both disturbed and relieved to be able to talk about that event 60 years afterwards. And as Moira and I talked about why that silence had sort of prevailed for so long, part of it, I think, was not just that people didn't talk about that stuff, you were supposed to get over it, but also that in the year following, war intervened. An even greater global trauma overwhelmed that local experience.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
The Second World War, announced here by the Australian Prime Minister on September the 3rd, would not only impact the bushfire recovery, it would change the country and the world forever. After the war and in the subsequent decades, while grappling with the nuclear threat of the Cold War, slowly and steadily a new era was ushered in. Advances in technology, greater wealth and income equality, improved standards of living, higher levels of education, and a cultural and social revolution that came with hippies and long hair. The contraceptive pill in 1961 liberated many women from the fear of an unplanned pregnancy and shifted the sexual moral high ground. In 1965, the Menzies Liberal government sent Australian troops to fight communism in Vietnam and conscripted 20-year-olds to war via a lottery system, releasing a tsunami of moral outrage and protest. The era culminated in 1972 with the election of Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister and the first Labor government since 1949.
Men and women of Australia. There are moments in history when the whole fate and future of nations can be decided by a single decision. For Australia, this is such a time. Our program has 3 great aims: to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people.
No Prime Minister's ushered in so much change.
In 3 short years, the Whitlam government brought in free healthcare, free university degrees, land rights, no-fault divorce, legal aid, the Racial Discrimination Act, and they abolished the death penalty and lowered the voting age to 18. But did you notice the clear agenda to shift democratic practices when Whitlam said one of their 3 aims was
to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land?
Whitlam is reflecting the strong call from citizens to change the way governments and communities behave and relate.
Once we get to the 60s and 70s, is I think the purview of local democracy broadens. In some ways, you know, a lot of the older forms of local democracy decay, you know, political party branches, local branches of unions, friendly societies, a lot of those I think became less significant. But you did get new forms of resident organisation occurring in many places, and their purview was wider. People demanded a much greater say over the conditions, the physical conditions of their own life. They weren't prepared to put up with state governments basically doing what they liked in a local community because they could. The great term of the era was quality of life. That term which we take for granted. You probably don't hear it as much these days, but people started using it actually, I think, in the late 50s. So it was sort of around from the late 50s. It really took off, though, in the 60s and 70s. And it was this idea that you couldn't simply shape a good life around a male breadwinner's wage. That wasn't enough. You actually needed to look at the broader conditions in which people lived, and not just men, you know, seen as the head of a household and a family, but people generally.
This idea of shaping a good life was no doubt an affront for the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in the post-war era because of the enormous barriers placed between them and opportunities for a good life. It was still the case in this era that Aboriginal welfare boards and similar bodies controlled where Indigenous people lived, worked, travelled and married. It was in 1956 that the British lit the first of 12 nuclear weapons test explosions on Aboriginal lands at Maralinga without permission or offering any protection. It was in this era that governments, after forcing Indigenous people onto mission reserves in the previous half-century, began forcing them off, to nowhere in particular, in a process they called assimilation. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had never stopped fighting for justice, and the activism shown in 1938 continued.
In 1946, over 800 Aboriginal men and women went on strike in the Pilbara, demanding to be paid cash, not rations. The strike lasted 3 years, and it's the longest strike in Australian history.
That was an AI voice. In 1963, the Yirrkala bark petitions were presented to the Australian Parliament by the Yolngu people trying to protect their lands, which were being plundered by mining companies. And in 1965, students from Sydney University, led by Charles Perkins, went on a freedom ride through New South Wales to raise awareness of the appalling living conditions and racism experienced by Aboriginal people. The following year, 200 Gurindji stockmen, domestic workers and their families went on strike from Wave Hill Station in the Northern Territory, immortalised in the song.
Vincent said, we're not talking about wages. We're staying right here till we get our land.
This eventually resulted a decade later in the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And then came 1967. Not only a watershed year for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights in Australia, but also the year of Australia's next major bushfire disaster. On the 7th of February, 110 separate fires raged across southern Tasmania. Fast and hot northerly winds brought them together and sent them within 2 kilometres of the centre of Hobart. 62 people were killed. 900 people were injured. 7,000 were left homeless. as well as the destruction of vital infrastructure like farms, factories, schools and power lines. For the first time, there is a media focus on the relief effort, although the fondness for melodrama and cinematic music continues.
Farms were destroyed. Desperate efforts to save belongings were futile. Too often, all that could be done was to stand and watch as a precious home died in the flames. Food, equipment, clothing, and the essentials for living are flowing into the fire-ravaged island. From all over the world, aid in the form of money and goods is helping to put stunned Tasmanians back on their feet. Red Cross and other welfare workers keep hard at it to restore hope for...
In the aftermath of these fires, we start to catch glimpses of the hallmark issues of the modern era. There's an awareness of the stress and trauma inflicted by disaster. Welfare workers are employed, and one, Barbara Ferguson, says this to the Canberra Times.
We can see problems after people move out. People can bear up for a while under a strain, but once they move into their homes, there is a danger that in their relief, they'll give way.
The journalist goes on to write,
Older people, particularly women, who had lost all their links with a dead husband or a lifetime's collection of little things were a problem.
One can only wonder what kind of problem they were. Perhaps it was just they were momentarily more visible.
Then there were the children, scared by wind and darkness.
The experience of social workers in the Tasmanian fires was later used in Brisbane's floods and Darwin's Cyclone Tracy, which both occurred in 1974. Tasmania was the first time there was a big clean-up day, where on a single day blocks were cleared of the burnt debris and thousands pitched in to help. People from the mainland donated all manner of goods, and for the first time there was the modern problem of too many donations, sometimes called another disaster because this overwhelming amount of stuff must be stored, catalogued and managed by someone. The acting Prime Minister John McEwen sends a minister to inspect the damage firsthand and coordinate the Commonwealth assistance, and the Navy is sent to help. The Federal Parliament passes the Tasmanian Grant Fire Relief Act 3 months after the fires, giving over $200 million in today's terms to Tasmania. And 4 days after the Tasmanian Fire Relief Act is passed, Australians vote overwhelmingly in favour of changes to the Constitution so that the Australian Parliament can make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they will be included in the census.
Why has it taken the white Australians just on 200 years to recognise us as a race of people?
The time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination against its indigenous people.
It's a matter of democratic right.
As the 70s dawn, the changes in society and government continue.
I think the impulse towards local self-government, communities having a say in the circumstances of their own lives, again, is a part of that kind of social revolution that occurred in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. It had all sorts of manifestations, residents' action groups, green bans, a whole range of things that local communities did in order to gain much greater control over the social and physical conditions of their communities.
While not articulated as such at the time, this notion was related to the Latin phrase nihil de nobis sine nobis, meaning nothing about us without us, which harks back to the origins of democracy in ancient Greece.
It's one of the challenges that representative democracy always faces. The further removed you are from a community in terms of making decisions about people's well-being and the national interest and everything, the greater the opportunity for there to be bad decision-making or partisan interests to dominate.
This is Dr. Duncan Iveson, Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Sydney.
And there's a principle in political theory called the most affected principle. There's variations of that. The people who are most impacted by decisions should probably have the most say. But how do you identify exactly where that is and what kind of institutional innovation do you need to make that happen? In relation to the fires, well, obviously the most impacted communities are those who suffer the most from the bushfires. How does our representative system make that happen? I think often disasters and crises expose and force us to rethink a bit. And in some ways, it goes right back to the origins of democracy, when you had the assembly in Athens, which is a very tiny proportion of the population, excluded obviously women, and the whole society was based on sort of slave labor. But in principle, the idea is that those who are most impacted by decision making should be the ones deciding how best to proceed and what policies should be pursued.
In Australia, one of the profound legacies of colonisation in the post-apocalyptic world Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people find themselves in is that not only has their land and wealth, language and culture been stripped away, but since white arrival, controlling legislation and decisions have been made for and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people without any input from them. For First Nations people, this push for more control over their lives has always been connected to land that was stolen en masse in the colonisation process. In 1972, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was established outside Parliament House in Canberra to demand Aboriginal land rights.
Land rights now! Land rights now! The government has brought down it.
And in 1980, in Western Victoria, two Gunditjmara women, Sandra Onus and Christina Frankland, brought a groundbreaking legal action against the Alcoa company that wanted to build an aluminium smelter on their traditional lands near Portland. The Supreme Court dismissed their claim, and the women took the matter to the High Court, where they were successful in convincing the court that their interest in the land was more than the general public's and more than other Aboriginal people. This was a huge win and led to the Victorian government, who wanted the smelter to go ahead, offering the Gunditjmara 53 hectares at the old Lake Conda Mission and Cemetery. The deal also came with funding for an Aboriginal corporation, as well as a commitment to reflood the lake and reconstruct the fish traps. Today, Tayrak, the name of the lake for thousands of years, is part of Budj Bim, the World Heritage listed land of the Gunditjmara people, home to one of the world's most extensive and oldest aquaculture systems. The steady push from communities everywhere to have a voice in decisions about where and how they live and how they're governed had a knock-on effect in how bureaucracies behaved and how public servants went about their work.
I think the relationship of the public service and bureaucracy to the ordinary citizen, the ordinary voter, has shifted enormously since the 30s. Bureaucracies became, at least in theory, more accountable. I mean, the new administrative law from the 1960s onwards, influenced by developments in the United States, meant that citizens were supposed to have more of a comeback in dealing with bureaucracy. You know, you have the emergence of an office such as that of the Ombudsman. There were a whole range of laws and bodies and tribunals that was supposed to give a greater protection to the ordinary citizen in dealing with the state, in dealing with public servants, in dealing with bureaucracy. There is also a much stronger culture, I would have thought, of consultation with communities on the part of bureaucracy and governments. Parliamentary inquiries invite submissions. They hold meetings in various places around Australia. I mean, there are a whole range of kind of rituals that exist now that were simply unknown back in the 1930s or a century ago.
Of course, having rights and those rights being accessible and meaningful are two quite different things.
There are all sorts of procedures that in theory exist for people to pursue, but they often die waiting. It takes so long to have complaints attended to. But I think it would be still broadly true that citizens are more empowered in their dealings with bureaucracy today compared with, say, a century ago. And the idea that bureaucracies should be accountable to ordinary citizens was a very underdeveloped one in those days. We know that a lot of these kinds of avenues are poorly funded by government. This is an aspect of neoliberalism.
An aspect of neoliberalism, which we'll explore more fully in the next episode. For now, let's just say that at the same time as our expectations of the state have been growing, there's been a shift in the context of citizen and government.
The capabilities of the state and expectations around what the state is meant to do have grown exponentially. The role of the state in generating economic development, in putting in place social welfare and social insurance programs, quite extraordinary changes occurred.
This is Professor Iverson again, this time in a talk he gave to the Australian Academy of Humanities.
And then you have this, obviously reaction against that in the 80s and 90s, again, speaking very broadly, where you have a lot of privatization going on. And the sort of downloading, if I could put it that way, of responsibility to individuals, right? The state should get out of people's way. We shouldn't create, dependency relations between citizens and the state. Markets are good. Government bureaucracies are bad. Let the market and let private providers step in where big, bad, slow-moving bureaucracies can't deliver. Let's get out of the way.
So as we enter the 21st century, all these wider changes are reflected in how communities impacted by disasters respond to and what they expect from government. At the same time, governments are being wound back in the shift to neoliberalism. It was in this first decade of the new century that another experience from my history shaped my understanding of the three-legged stool that is bushfire, community and government. Not long after I'd finished the project about women and children in Macedon on Ash Wednesday, when I met Morna Kenworthy, I saw an ad for a community fire presenter and facilitator for the Country Fire Authority working in communities to prepare them for fire. I was hired and headed off for several days training in a fancy accommodation centre in the Yarra Valley. We were trained in skills for group facilitation as well as educated in fire behaviour, the Victorian Stay or Go policy and the Fire Danger Index, the FDI. While the principles behind these programs were good, particularly the community fireguard groups which brought groups of neighbours together to have conversations, something was lost in the translation. It felt like we were being taught how to lecture people on the state's stay or go policy, and in the most basic of terms, catering to the lowest common denominator. For example, the Fire Danger Index, a formula that takes things like temperature, humidity, wind speed and fuel load and calculates them into a number between 0 and 100 that gives the level of fire risk. We were told that the FDI was complex and too confusing to tell the public about. All they needed to know was whether it was a total fire ban day or not. Behind the scenes, though, when the FDI got to 50, the day would be declared a day of total fire ban. Well, actually, the Bureau of Meteorology calculated the FDI, but it was the fire authorities who decided if it was a total fire ban day, and so sometimes a total fire ban day was declared without it reaching 50 and vice versa. No, the agencies did not get confused. But look, the point is that the public don't need to know about the FDI because they'll get confused. Somebody was confused. After the training, I was employed as a fire-ready presenter and community fireguard facilitator. It was a casual seasonal job that ran from around October to December. We didn't offer the sessions to people after December because by then it was too late. The fire season had started. Too late? Yes, they should have already done all their preparations. You're kidding me. Because they ought to have prepared before the fire season started, we won't offer information when the weather's hot, the risk is high, and fire is on everyone's mind? It was a deeply paternalistic attitude that ignored human nature, the end-of-year rush, the motivation of bad fire weather, and the obvious fact that it's never too late to learn about fire. I did this job for 4 summers, and what I found sitting in lounge rooms and on dusty, dry roadsides was that people and communities were smart and interested. They'd often thought a lot about their situation, and they were hungry to discuss realistic and practical ways of living with this risk in the landscapes they loved. They didn't want a finger-wagging parental lecture from a know-it-all. But for the agencies, risk management was the guiding principle. So long as the public were told two things, they couldn't rely on a truck or a warning, and they needed to make a bushfire plan, then the authorities had done their job. They could say, "We told you so," and most importantly, they would have an answer for the coroner or the Royal Commissioner. A level of defensiveness no doubt brought about by the accusatory nature of most post-fire inquiries. The shift by governments to align with business rather than community continued into the 21st century in a capitalist neoliberal freefall, a perfect storm waiting for a crisis, which came to Victoria on and after Black Saturday in 2009. In episode 1, we heard from the poster child of community-led recovery, the actions of the people of Strathewen after the Black Saturday fires. In the next episode of Democracy After Disaster, we'll explore a very different story that unfolded less than 15 kilometres away at the top of the range in the community of Kinglake.
I don't call it recovery. I think it's a dumbass name. It's a name that's like a whistle, a dog whistle for welfare, for church organisations, for everyone to come in and have their agenda.
This is Daryl Taylor, resident of Kinglake and a deep community and political systems thinker. And he'll take us on a wild ride through ideas and experiences, stories and concepts rising out of the Black Saturday fires. Democracy After Disaster is written, produced and hosted by me, Kate Lawrence from Storyground. This podcast was made on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to ancestors and elders. I thank them for their careful and sacred use of fire in this landscape and their inspiring sense of community. This project is auspiced by Highlands FM community radio station and supported by a grant from the National Australia Bank. Huge thanks in this episode to Sue Yardley and Ainsley Munro-Lawrence for lending their voices to dramatise moments as only a living, breathing human voice can. And to Steve Pascoe for giving critical feedback on an early draft. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it wherever you listen, and most importantly, tell your colleagues, friends and family. And if you have any comments, questions or feedback, please email me, kate@storyground.com.au. Thanks for listening.